Welcome to my channel.
The persistent drizzle, a fine, almost invisible mist that clung to the heather and seeped into one's bones, was, to Hamish Macbeth, simply part of the furniture. It was a Tuesday, a day he usually reserved for the delicate art of doing precisely nothing, a pursuit he had honed to perfection over his many years as the solitary police constable of Lochdubh. The early morning air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and distant peat fires, a comforting perfume that promised another day of blessed, uninterrupted idleness. His current ambition, a particularly plump salmon he'd been tracking for a week in a quiet eddy of the big river, was proving elusive. He knelt by the bank, a rusty old creel beside him, the line barely visible in the grey light. His uniform cap was pulled low, disguising the flicker of cunning in his mild blue eyes. Some might call it poaching, but Hamish considered it resourceful provisioning. After all, a man had to eat, and the Lochdubh shops, bless their well-meaning hearts, rarely stocked anything more exciting than tinned haggis and slightly bruised apples. "Ah, ye wee rascal," he murmured, more to himself than the unseen fish. "Thinking you're too clever for old Hamish, eh?" A sudden jarring ring shattered the peace. His mobile phone, a clunky, outdated model he often forgot to charge, vibrated against a moss-covered stone. He sighed, a profound exhalation of annoyance. It would be Blair. It was always Blair, demanding he account for some missing form or some imagined dereliction of duty. Hamish let it ring, watching the river flow, the gentle gurgle a far more pleasant sound than the tinny jingle of his phone. Eventually, it fell silent, peace, temporarily, restored. He was just contemplating the strategic deployment of a particularly enticing worm, when a sound, far more unusual than Blair's digital summons, drifted over the moor. It was the distinct thrum of a high-performance engine, tearing through the quiet glens with an almost offensive urgency. Hamish winced. It was always the same. Just when the Highlands settled into its natural, unhurried rhythm, some Sassenach, usually from London, with more money than sense and a car the colour of a bruised plum, would descend upon Lochdubh, convinced they were bringing culture or investment to the quaint natives. Sure enough, a sleek, utterly preposterous Bentley Continental GT, a shimmering metallic blue that offended the muted greens and greys of the landscape, swept into view on the narrow track above the river. It pulled to an abrupt halt, sending a shower of gravel over the verge. The door opened, and a man emerged, looking utterly out of place. He was tall, with a carefully cultivated tan that spoke of expensive sunbeds rather than actual sun. His suit, a sharp, impeccably tailored linen number, was a colour Hamish could only describe as frightfully beige. A silk scarf, knotted with unnecessary flair, nestled at his throat. He carried a silver-tipped walking stick, which he seemed to wield more as an accessory than a necessity. This, Hamish instantly deduced, was a man who believed the world revolved around his meticulously manicured fingernails. "Excuse me," the man called out, his voice a polished, booming baritone that cut through the Highland air like a razor. "I say, you there, are you quite all right?" Hamish slowly straightened, brushing peat from his trousers. He squinted at the newcomer, a silent assessment taking place behind his guileless expression. "I'm fine, thank ye kindly, just communing with nature." The Sassenach's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose. "Communing with a fishing rod? My dear fellow, one communes with nature through meditation, through appreciating its raw, untamed beauty, not by catching its inhabitants." He gestured expansively at the river, as if it were a particularly well-stocked display cabinet in Harrods. "Oh, well, the fish and I have an understanding," Hamish replied, his voice a slow, deliberate drawl. "I try to catch them. They try to escape. Keeps us all on our toes." The man gave a dismissive laugh, a theatrical puff of air. "Amusing, you Highlanders, so rustic. Tell me, do you know if this ghastly track leads to Lochdubh proper? My sat-nav, confound it, seems to have lost its way in this wilderness." "Aye, that it does," Hamish confirmed, pointing with his fishing rod. "Just follow it round the bend there, past TBR Bar. Ye Old Croft. Can't miss it. Excellent. Thank you, my good man." The Sassenach paused, fixing Hamish with a condescending stare. You wouldn't happen to be Constable Macbeth, would you, the local law? Hamish's heart sank. News travelled fast, even to the furthest reaches of the Highlands. That would be me, I. Ah, splendid, the man beamed, revealing a set of teeth almost too white to be natural. Julian Ponsonby Smythe, here to purchase the old MacLeod estate, turning it into an exclusive retreat, you see. Holistic wellness, artisan cheese-making, bespoke tartan weaving, all frightfully authentic. I dare say we'll be seeing a great deal of each other, Constable. One must, after all, ensure the local elements are kept in check. He gave a patronising wink. Hamish merely nodded, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. I dare say we will, Mr. Ponsonby Smythe. Julian Ponsonby Smythe, clearly satisfied with this exchange, climbed back into his Bentley, the engine roaring to life with an unnecessary flourish. As the expensive car sped off, leaving a faint scent of petrol and expensive cologne in its wake, Hamish sighed again. The peace was well and truly shattered. Ponsonby Smythe was the kind of man who rubbed everyone, Highland or not, the wrong way. A pompous peacock preening in a land that cared not a jot for his money or his artisan cheese. Hamish had a premonition, a cold ripple of unease, that Julian Ponsonby Smythe's arrival in Lochdubh would bring no bar. Thing but trouble. He looked back at his fishing rod, the promise of a quiet morning now utterly ruined. Well, he muttered to the river, there goes a perfectly good Tuesday. He reeled in his line, the salmon forgotten. A new, far more unpleasant catch had just arrived in his peaceful patch of the Highlands. The following morning did nothing to improve the atmosphere. The fine mist had graduated into a persistent soaking rain that turned the peat tracks into slick ribbons of black treacle. Hamish sat in his small kitchen, the rhythmic drip-drip of a leak in the scullery providing a melancholy soundtrack to his breakfast. He had just poured a third cup of coffee, thick, black and strong enough to jump-start a dead tractor, when the telephone shrieked. This time it wasn't the mobile, it was the landline, the official police line that Hamish usually treated with the same suspicion one might afford a sleeping adder. He sighed, his long, lanky frame unfolding from the wooden chair. Lugs, his ugly but loyal mongrel of indeterminate breed, looked up from his spot by the stove and gave a low, sympathetic whine. "I know, Lugs," Hamish muttered, reaching for the receiver. "It's too early for the world to be broken." It was Mrs. Kennedy, the village's unofficial town crier and official postmistress. Her voice was thin and vibrating with a frequency that suggested she was currently standing on her tiptoes. "Hamish Macbeth, are ye there? You must get down to the old MacLeod Piberb. This instant. It's that English gentleman, the one in the fancy car. He's in a terrible state, Hamish. A terrible state indeed." "Calm down, Mrs. Kennedy," Hamish said, already reaching for his heavy oilskins. "What sort of state? Is he stuck in the mud? I warned him about those tyres on the Bentley. He's beyond the mud, Hamish. He's in the water, or half in anyway. Archie the post was doing his rounds and nearly had a heart attack. He says it's a judgment from the Lord, but I say it's a murder." Hamish felt the familiar leaden weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. A death in Lochdubh was never just a death. It was a communal event, a source of endless speculation, and, most annoyingly, an invitation for the Strathbane police to invade his sanctuary. He whistled for lugs, shoved his feet into his Wellingtons, and stepped out into the grey Highland morning. The old MacLeod pier was a crumbling finger of stone that poked tentatively into the dark, choppy waters of the loch. As Hamish approached, he saw a small huddle of locals standing well back, their faces pale against the dark wool of their coats. Archie the post was there, clutching his mailbag as if it were a shield, and Porrick, the owner of the local hardware shop, was shaking his head slowly. Hamish walked past them, his face a mask of professional boredom that hid a sharp scanning gaze. There, at the end of the pier, lay Julian Ponsonby Smythe. The scene was as bizarre as it was grim. The frightfully beige linen suit was now a sodden, muddy brown. Julian was draped over an old, rusted iron bollard in a posture that was almost comedically dramatic, as if he had been caught mid-theatrical faint. But it was the manner of his death that gave Hamish pause. Wrapped tightly around Julian's neck and stuffed rather unceremoniously into his open mouth was a long, vibrantly coloured strip of fabric. It was a tartan, not just any tartan, but a garish, neon-bright pattern of pink, lime green, and electric blue. A small plastic tag fluttered from the end of the cloth in the wind. Hamish leaned closer, squinting through the rain. It read, "Bespoke Heritage, the Lochdubh Dream Collection." "He's been strangled with his own vision," Hamish murmured. "What's that, Hamish?" Porrick called out, his voice trembling. Is he really gone?" "Aye, Porrick, he's gone." Hamish stood up, ignoring the dampness seeping through his trousers. He looked around the pier. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, no muddy footprints other than Julian's own pointed Italian loafers, which were neatly aligned at the edge of the stone. It looked as though he had simply walked to the end of the pier to meet someone, and had been silenced with the very product he intended to use to rebrand the village. The dark humour of the situation wasn't lost on Hamish, but neither was the danger. Julian Ponsonby Smythe had been in Lochdubh for less than 24 hours, yet someone had hated High enough, or feared him enough, to kill him in a way that felt pointedly insulting. Right then, Hamish addressed the small crowd. "Back to your homes, all of you. There's nothing to see here but a tragedy and a lot of cold rain. Archie, go and sit in the hotel and have a dram. You look like you've seen a ghost." "I have, Hamish. The ghost of Scottish industry," Archie wailed, but he began to shuffle away toward the Lochdubh Hotel. Hamish turned back to the body. He noticed a small detail that the casual observer would have missed. Tucked into Julian's breast pocket, where a silk pocket square should have been, was a single dried sprig of white heather. White heather was supposed to be lucky, but for Julian it had proven to be quite the opposite. He took out his notebook and began to jot down a few observations in his cramped, messy shorthand. He wasn't looking for fingerprints or DNA, he was looking at the way the body was positioned. It wasn't a panicked killing. It was deliberate. It was almost tidy. Just as he was beginning to reconstruct the victim's final moments in his head, a familiar high-pitched roar echoed across the water. It was the sound of a police siren, a sound that rarely meant anything good for the peace of Lochdubh. A white and blue patrol car from Strathbane came screaming around the headland, followed closely by a black, unmarked saloon. Hamish's shoulders slumped. The circus was arriving. Within minutes, the quiet pier was swarming with men in suits, who looked far too clean for the Highlands. Doors slammed, and a short, stout man with a face the colour of an overripe plum stomped toward him. Detective Chief Inspector Blair was in a foul mood, which was his default setting. He hated the Highlands, he hated the rain, and above all else, he hated Hamish Macbeth. He viewed Hamish as a constant reminder of the inefficiency and peasant nonsense that he believed held back the Scottish police force. "Macbeth," Blair bellowed, his voice bouncing off the hills. "What the devil have you done now? I leave you alone for 5 minutes, and you've managed to get a wealthy Londoner murdered on your doorstep. Do you have any idea the paperwork this is going to involve? The press will be all over this like flies on a midden." Hamish kept his expression blank and vacant. "Good morning to you too, sir. It's a bit of a damp one, isn't it?" "Damp? Damp?" Blair's face turned a shade deeper toward purple. "There's a corpse with a neon rag in its mouth, and you're talking about the weather. Get out of the way, you useless streak of nothing. Let the real police handle this. Go and find a lost cat or something." Hamish stepped back, his hands deep in his pockets. He watched as Blair's team began to clumsily cordon off the pier, knocking over a bucket of bait in the process. He saw Blair pointing at the neon tartan with a look of disgusted confusion.
"What is this rubbish?"
Blair barked at one of his sergeants. "Is this some kind of cult thing? A Highland ritual?" "It's a sample of the new bespoke tartan the deceased was planning to manufacture, sir," Hamish offered helpfully from the sidelines. "I didn't ask you, Macbeth," Blair snapped. "Go on, clear off. Take that mangy cur of yours and disappear before I find a reason to have you suspended for negligence." Hamish didn't argue. He knew when to retreat. As he walked back toward the village with lugs trotting at his heels, he wasn't thinking about Blair's insults or the impending media storm. He was thinking about the white heather in the pocket and the fact that Julian Ponsonby Smythe hadn't been wearing his silver-tipped walking stick. The stick was gone. And in a village like Lochdubh, where everyone knew everything about everyone, a missing stick was a much louder clue than a neon tartan. He needed a cup of tea, and he knew exactly whose kitchen would have the best gossip to go with it. The formal investigation had begun, which meant the real investigation could now start in earnest. Hamish made his way up the brae toward the village, his long legs moving with a deceptive slow-motion gait that suggested he was merely drifting with the wind rather than heading anywhere in particular. Behind him, the flashing blue lights of the police cars pulsed against the grey curtain of rain, looking garish and entirely foreign. To the casual observer, Hamish looked like a man defeated by his superior's arrival, a village bobby sent packing like a naughty schoolboy. In reality, he was quite relieved. As long as Blair was busy trampling all over the physical evidence and shouting at the gulls, Hamish was free to do the kind of police work that actually yielded results in the Highlands. He was going to have a chat. He bypassed the police station, a small stone building that shared a wall with his cottage, and headed straight for the Lochdubh hotel. The hotel was the beating heart of the village's information network, presided over by Mrs. Curry, a woman whose ears were as sharp as her tongue. As he pushed open the heavy oak door, the scent of stale hops, wood smoke, and damp wool washed over him. It was a comforting smell, the scent of secrets being shared over small whiskies. The bar was uncharacteristically crowded for a Wednesday morning. Archie the post was there, as promised, staring into a glass of amber liquid with the glassy eyes of a man who had seen too much neon polyester. Nearby, the local minister, Mr. Wellington, sat with a ginger ale, looking grave. "Hamish," Mrs. Curry said, leaning over the bar, her eyes glittering with a hunger for news. "Blair and his circus are down at the pier, then? I saw them tearing through the village like the devil was chasing them. Is it true? Is that poor Mr. Ponsonby Smythe really dead?" "He's dead enough for Blair to be happy," Hamish replied, sliding onto a stool. "He's got a whole team down there looking for footprints in the mud." "I don't suppose there's any coffee going, Mrs. Curry, and tea?" "Perhaps a biscuit. I've had a busy morning being insulted. I'll get ye a pot," she said, already moving toward the kitchen. "But you'll tell me what happened. Archie says there was a bright pink rag involved." "It was a tartan," Hamish said softly, casting a glance toward Archie. "One of the samples the gentleman was showing around. Tell me, Archie, when you saw him this morning, did you see his walking stick? The silver-topped one?" Archie blinked, his mind struggling to move past the image of the body. "The stick? No, Hamish, no stick, just him and that awful cloth. He looked like a Christmas cracker that had gone horribly wrong." Hamish nodded slowly. He sipped the coffee Mrs. Curry placed before him, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. "Did he have many visitors at the hotel last night? He was staying in the Rose Suite, wasn't he?" "Visitors?" Mrs. Curry snorted. "He had an audience. He spent the whole evening in the residence lounge, lecturing anyone who would listen about elevating the Highland aesthetic. He had those samples draped over the furniture like he was decorating a boudoir. Poor Geordie the shepherd almost choked on his pint when the man told him his tweed was drab and culturally stagnant." "And did anyone seem particularly interested in his aesthetics?" Hamish asked. Mrs. Curry leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Young Fergus MacLean was in. You know Fergus, takes great pride in the old ways, he does. He did burr, and take kindly to being told his family's weaving history was a lost opportunity for monetization. There were words, Hamish, sharp ones. And then there was that woman." Hamish's ears pricked up. What woman? A stranger. Arrived late after the kitchen had closed. Very elegant, very English. She didn't stay here, though. She asked where the MacLeod estate was and drove off in a little red sports car. But before she left, she saw Ponsonby Smythe across the lounge. I saw her face in the mirror, Hamish. She looked like she'd just stepped on something nasty, bar. Did they speak, bar? Not a word. But the look was enough to sour the milk. Ponsonby Smythe didn't see her. He was too busy explaining to the minister why the church pews should be upholstered in lime green velvet, barra. Hamish sighed, finishing his coffee. The picture was becoming more cluttered, not clearer. A furious local weaver, a mysterious woman in a red car, and a victim who seemed to have made a career out of being insufferable. He thought again of the white heather in the pocket. It was a traditional Scottish symbol, often associated with the Jacobites, but also a common gift for luck. In this context, it felt like a silent, mocking commentary. He was a very loud man, Hamish. Mr. Wellington added from his corner, his voice gentle. But nobody deserves to meet their maker with such a lack of dignity. He mentioned he was meeting someone this morning at the pier to finalize the vision. He seemed quite excited about Itibar Bar. Did he say who, Minister? I'm afraid not. He just said it was someone with the keys to the future. I assumed he meant a lawyer or a surveyor. Hamish stood up, adjusting his belt. The keys to the future had apparently led Julian Ponsonby Smythe to a very permanent dead end. As he walked toward the door, he spotted a familiar figure entering the hotel. It was Priscilla Halberton Smythe, the daughter of the local landowner, and a woman who occupied a very specific, painful corner of Hamish's heart. She looked as cool and composed as ever, her blonde hair perfectly styled, despite the rain. "Hamish," she said, her expression softening slightly, "I heard the news. My father is in a state. He was the one brokering the sale of the MacLeod land to Mr. Ponsonby Smythe. This is going to be a disaster for the estate." "Aye, it's a mess, Priscilla," Hamish said, stepping outside with her into the sheltered porch. "Your father, he didn't happen to mention if Julian had any enemies, other than everyone he spoke to, I mean." Priscilla frowned, her eyes scanning the mist-covered hills. "He was an arrogant man, Hamish. He treated people like stage props. But there was something else. Yesterday afternoon I saw him arguing with someone by the old bridge. It was a woman in a red car. She seemed quite desperate, and he was laughing at her. He kept waving a silver stick at her as if she were a troublesome dog. The stick again, babur," Hamish muttered. "And the woman, you didn't happen to catch her name?" "No," Priscilla said, looking at him intently. "But Hamish, be careful. Blair is telling everyone in the village that you're obstructing the investigation. He's looking for a scapegoat, and you know how much he likes to blame the local talent." "Och, I'm used to being the village idiot, Priscilla. It's a comfortable role," Hamish said with a tired smile. But as he watched her walk away, his mind was already moving ahead. The red car, the missing stick, the white heather, and the neon tartan. The pieces were there, scattered like stones in the heather. He just needed to sit quietly enough for them to start making sense. He decided it was time to visit Fergus MacLean. Fergus was a man of few words and a very short fuse, and he had a shed full of looms that produced the very best and most traditional tweed in the county. If anyone hated the idea of bespoke heritage neon tartan, it would be Fergus. As Hamish walked, the rain began to thin, revealing the dark, brooding peaks of the mountains that loomed over Lochdubh like silent judges. He had a feeling the mountains knew exactly who had walked onto that pier this morning, and they weren't in a hurry to tell him. He would have to find out the hard way, by being exactly the kind of useless peasant Blair accused him of being. He would listen to the silences between the words. He walked to Fergus MacLean's croft, took Hamish away from the prying eyes of the Viber Burr, Lage and higher up into the foothills, where the air was thinner and smelled of wet wool and gorse. The path was steep, and lugs trotted ahead, pausing occasionally to sniff at a rabbit hole or look back at his master with a questioning tilt of his head. Hamish didn't hurry. He knew that in the Highlands, arriving too fast was a sign of aggression. To get the truth out of a man like Fergus, one had to appear as though one had simply drifted in on the breeze, perhaps in search of nothing more than a light for a pipe or a comment on the price of mutton. As he rounded the final bend, the rhythmic thwack-clack of a heavy loom echoed from a corrugated iron shed behind the main stone cottage. It was a steady, industrious sound, a defiant heartbeat against the modern world. Fergus MacLean was a man carved from the very granite of the hills, gnarled, grey, bearded, and possessed of a stare that could wither a thistle at 20 paces. He didn't stop working when Hamish appeared in the doorway, the frame casting a long shadow over the floorboards. "I heard the siren," Fergus grunted, his hands moving with practised precision as the shuttle flew back and forth. "I assumed they'd finally come to take ye away for vagrancy, Macbeth." "Not today, Fergus," Hamish replied, leaning casually against the doorpost. He took off his peaked cap and wiped a bead of rain from the brim. "Though Blair did suggest I find a lost cat. It seems the London gentleman, Mr. Ponsonby Smythe, had a bit of an acid ent down at the old pier this morning." The loom stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the wind whistling through the gaps in the tin roof. Fergus turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. Accident, was it? Or did the weight of his own vanity finally pull him into the loch? A man who thinks pink and lime green belong on a loom deserves whatever the water gives him. Hamish stepped further into the shed, his eyes wandering over the bolts of rich, earthy tweed stacked against the wall, deep heathers, mossy greens, and the blue of a Highland twilight. He was strangled, Fergus, with a strip of that very cloth he was so proud of. Someone took a great deal of offence at his vision for the village. Fergus snorted and reached for a tin of tobacco on a nearby workbench. Offence? It was an abomination. He came here yesterday afternoon, stood right where you're standing, and told me my wool was antiquated. He wanted me to use his synthetic dyes. Said he'd bought the MacLeod land and that I'd be his head weaver or I'd be nothing. I told him I'd sooner weave a shroud for him than a yard of that neon filth. Hamish watched Fergus's hands as he rolled a cigarette. They were steady, but there was a faint yellow stain on his thumb that hadn't been there the week before. A chemical stain, perhaps. He was a man who didn't take no for an answer, I gather. Priscilla saw him arguing with a woman in a red car by the bridge. You wouldn't happen to know anything about a woman Fergus? Or perhaps where his silver walking stick got to? Fergus paused, the match halfway to his cigarette. I saw the car, flashy little thing like a blister on the road. It was parked up by the estate gates yesterday evening, but as for his stick, he was waving it about like a conductor's baton when he left here. If it's missing, maybe it's at the bottom of the loch with his dignity. Hamish nodded, his gaze dropping to a scrap of fabric caught in the teeth of a smaller, unused loom in the corner. It was a fragment of white wool, remarkably fine, unlike the hardy Cheviot Fergus usually worked with. You're trying your hand at something new, then? Fergus followed his gaze and scowled. That's none of your concern, Macbeth. Now, if you've finished your mooching, I've work to do. Unlike some in this village, I don't get paid to stand about looking gormless. Hamish smiled, a slow, easy expression that didn't reach his sharp eyes. Aye, Fergus, we all have our burdens. I'll leave you to it. As he stepped out into the rain, Hamish felt the prickle of intuition at the base of his neck. Fergus was angry, certainly, and he had the strength to do the deed, but there was a bitterness in him that felt more like grief than murderous rage. He whistled for lugs and began the descent back toward Lochdubh, but he didn't head for the station. Instead, he made a detour toward the local curry shop, the Taj of the North. Habib, the owner, was a man who saw everything from his window overlooking the main square. He was currently polishing a glass with a vigour that suggested he was agitated. When Hamish entered, the bells chimed, and Habib immediately beckoned him over. "Constable! Such business, such drama!" Habib exclaimed, leaning over the counter. "The big policeman from the city, the one with the face like a tinned ham, he has been in here. He shouted at me because I could not tell him if the victim liked spicy food. What does the spice have to do with the killing, I ask you?" "Blair likes to bark at whatever's in front of him, Habib," Hamish said, accepting a small cup of overly sweet tea. "Did you see anything of interest yesterday evening? Perhaps the English gentleman or a red sports car?" Habib's eyes widened. "The car, yes. It was here late. The lady, she came in for a bottled water. Very stressed, Hamish. Very pale. She was asking about the MacLeod pier. She wanted to know if it was private property. I told her the whole village uses it for the fishing, but she didn't seem to care about the fish. She looked like she wanted to throw herself in, but did she give a name? No name, but she dropped a card on the floor when she reached for her purse. I tried to give it back, but she sped away like a racer." Habib reached under the counter and produced a small, elegant business card. It was thick, cream-coloured cardstock with gold-embossed lettering. Elena Ponsonby. "Restoration specialist. Ponsonby," Hamish whispered, the tea cooling in his hand. "Not PBR bar." "Ponsonby Smythe?" "Just Ponsonby," Habib confirmed. "She didn't look like a wife, Hamish. She looked like a creditor." Hamish tucked the card into his pocket. The connection was tightening, a restoration specialist and a man who wanted to rebrand the Highlands. It was a classic clash of interests, but was it enough for murder? He looked out the window and saw Blair's team heading toward the pub. No doubt for a lunch they would try to claim on expenses. Blair was currently leaning against the Bentley, looking triumphant as he spoke into his radio. He'd clearly found someone to arrest. Hamish watched as the police sergeant, Anderson, emerged from a side street, leading a bewildered-looking young man in handcuffs. It was Fergus MacLean's nephew, a lad who did the heavy lifting at the Croft Bar. "Och, Blair," Hamish sighed, his heart sinking. "You've gone for the easy mark again." He knew he couldn't intervene directly, not yet. He needed to find the woman in the red car, and he needed to find out why Julian Ponsonby Smythe had been carrying a sprig of white heather in a village that had plenty of reasons to wish him gone. He finished his tea, thanked Habib, and stepped back out into the drizzle. It was time to visit the manse. The minister had mentioned a key to the future, and Hamish had a feeling that key didn't fit a door, but a very old and very dusty secret. The arrest of young Callum, Fergus MacLean's nephew, had the predictable effect of a stone tossed into a stagnant pond. As Hamish walked back through the village square, he could feel the ripples of resentment vibrating from every doorway. The locals didn't much like the MacLeans. They were a dour, prickly lot, but they liked the heavy-handed interference of the Strathbane police even less. Blair was currently standing by the patrol car, looking remarkably smug as he adjusted his tie for a local news crew that had just rattled into town. He spotted Hamish and signalled him over with a sharp, imperious flick of his wrist. "Bah! There you are, Macbeth," Blair barked, his voice carrying across the square. "See how it's done, while you were busy mooching, tea and chatting with the shopkeepers. My men found the murder weapon's origin and the muscle that used it. We found a stash of that neon rag in the lad's workshop, along with a motive as old as the hills, resentment of progress. He's as good as convicted Burr." Hamish looked at the ground, his face a picture of gormless submission. "Is that so, sir? And the lad? Did he say why he chose the pier, or what he did with the gentleman's walking stick?" "Bah." Blair's face twitched. "The stick is irrelevant, Macbeth. Probably tossed it in the loch in a panic. The point is, we've got our man. I'll be expecting a full report on your activities this morning by 5 o'clock. Try to use words with more than one syllable, if you can manage it." Hamish touched the brim of his cap. "I'll do my best, sir, though my spelling isn't what it used to be." He turned away before blabber brr could erupt again, feeling the weight of the business card in his pocket. He knew Callum. The lad was strong as an ox, but had the temperament of a particularly shy sheep. He wouldn't have the stomach to stuff a rag down a man's throat, let alone the cunning to stage a body with such theatrical flair. He made his way toward the manse, a sturdy stone house tucked behind the kirk where the wind always seemed to howl a little louder. He needed a sounding board, and since Priscilla was likely busy with her father's estate crisis, he hoped to find the minister's wife, or perhaps the minister himself, in a reflective mood. However, as he turned the corner near the old bridge, he saw a flash of scarlet reflected in the wet pavement. A small red sports car was parked haphazardly half on, half off the verge, its engine ticking as it cooled. Standing by the stone parapet of the bridge was the woman from the hotel. Up close, she looked even more fragile than Habib had described. She was wearing a trench coat that cost more than Hamish's annual salary, but it was stained with mud at the hem. Her hair, a dark, sophisticated bob, was being ruined by the mist, and she was staring down into the rushing water with a look of profound exhaustion. "It's a long drop, and the water's colder than it looks," Hamish said softly, keeping his distance so as not to startle her. The woman jumped, spinning around to face him. Her eyes were red-rimmed. "You're the policeman," she said, her voice trembling. "Gee, but holding a residue of London steel, the local one. Ponsonby Smythe mentioned you. He called you a quaint relic. He had a way with words, Mr. Ponsonby Smythe," Hamish replied, stepping closer. "And you must be Elena Ponsonby, the restoration specialist." She stiffened. "How do you know that?" "You dropped a card at the curry shop. And the village is small, Miss Ponsonby. News travels faster than that car of yours. I hear you and Julian had a bit of a disagreement yesterday." Elena let out a harsh, jagged laugh. "Disagreement? Julian was a parasite. He was my ex-husband, Constable. He took my family's reputation, my designs and my capital, and he rebranded them as his own. That bespoke heritage nonsense? Those were my patterns, stolen from my private archives. He was going to use them to turn this village into a plastic playground for influencers." Hamish leaned against the bridge, his blue eyes fixed on the distant peaks. "So you followed him here to stop him?" "I followed him to serve him with an injunction. I met him at the pier this morning. Well, I was supposed to meet him. He told me he had something to show me, a key to the future that would make all my legal threats vanish. But when I got there, he was already like that. I panicked. I saw those police cars and I drove. I knew how it would look, and the walking stick." Hamish asked, "Did you see it?" Elena frowned, wiping a stray tear from her cheek. "No, he wasn't carrying it. But there was someone else." Constable. "As I was driving away, I saw a woman walking up the path from the pier. She was wearing a long dark cloak and carrying something heavy. I thought it was a local, but she moved differently, very upright, very old-fashioned. A dark cloak," Hamish repeated. "And did you see where she went? Toward the village. She disappeared into the trees near the hotel." Hamish felt a cold prickle of realization. The key to the future wasn't a document or a legal loophole. It was a social dynamic he had overlooked. He thought of the white heather and the neon tartan. It was a clash of the new and the old, but the old in Lochdubh didn't just mean the weavers. It meant the old families, the ones who had held the land long before the Halberton Smythes had bought their way in. "Miss Ponsonby," Hamish said, his tone turning serious, "I suggest you go to the hotel, check in, and stay there. I won't tell Blair you were at the pier just yet. He's already arrested a man, and he's not fond of being told he's wrong. But I'll need to talk to you again." She nodded, looking relieved to be given an order. As she climbed back into her car and sped off toward the village, Hamish remained on the bridge. He looked at the white heather growing wild on the banks. It wasn't just a symbol of luck, it was a symbol of the MacLeod clan. His mind raced. Julian had been buying the MacLeod estate. The last of the MacLeods was supposed to have died out years ago, leaving the land to the crown. Sh was now selling it off through Priscilla's father. But what if there was a survivor? Someone who didn't want their ancestral home turned into an exclusive retreat with neon upholstery? He needed to speak to Priscilla again. She knew the history of the estates better than anyone. If there was a hidden motive, a petty human grudge buried under layers of Highland history, she would be the one to help him dig it up. He turned back toward the village, his lazy stride quickening just a fraction. The trap was beginning to take shape in his mind, but he needed one more piece of the puzzle, and he had a feeling that piece was currently sitting in a very elegant drawing room, sipping tea and watching the rain. He whistled for Lugs, who was busy investigating a suspicious-looking frog. "Come on, lad. We've a lady to visit, and I don't mean the one in the red car." Hamish made his way toward the Tommel Castle estate, the ancestral seat of the Halberton Smythes, where the driveway was lined with ancient oaks that seemed to weep under the weight of the endless Highland rain. The grand stone facade of the house loomed through the mist, a monument to a sort of ordered, upper-class stability that Julian Ponsonby Smythe had been so desperate to imitate and then dismantle. Hamish felt the familiar, uncomfortable tug of his own status as he walked up to the door. The tall, lanky village copper with mud on his boots, and a dog that smelled of wet moorland. Priscilla was in the morning room, a space filled with the scent of beeswax and old books. She was staring out at the gardens, a cup of Earl Grey untouched on the low table beside her. When Hamish was shown in, she didn't look surprised. She merely gestured for him to sit, her eyes tracing the worried lines on his face that he usually kept hidden behind a mask of vacant cheer. "Blair has arrested Callum MacLean," Hamish said without preamble, sinking into a chair that felt far too delicate for a man of his stature. "He thinks the lad's resentment over the neon tartan is enough to hang him. But Callum hasn't the wit for the staging, Priscilla. That body was a message, not a tantrum barbara." Priscilla turned, her expression guarded. "My father is relieved, Hamish. He wants this settled. The sale of the MacLeod land is a complicated legal knot, and Julian's death has made it a nightmare. If it's a local dispute, the estate can move on. If it's something else, bah." "Tea is something else," Hamish interrupted softly. "I met Elena Ponsonby by the bridge. Julian's ex-wife. He stole her work, her life's blood, and was planning to sell it back to the world as authentic Lochdubh heritage. She has motive enough, but she saw someone else, a woman in a dark cloak, walking away from the pier, someone who moved with the grace of the old world, bar P. Isilla's hand tightened around her saucer. A dark cloak? Hamish, there aren't many people who still wear the heavy wool cloaks of the last century. Most of them are in museum displays, OBR, or kept in the cedar chests of the very old families. That's what I was thinking, Hamish said, his voice dropping to a low, rhythmic hum. I keep thinking about that sprig of white heather in Julian's pocket. It wasn't just luck, it was a claim. Tell me, Priscilla, who really owned the MacLeod land before the Crown stepped in? I know the male line failed, but was there truly no one left? But Priscilla sighed, finally taking a sip of her tea. The history is messy. The MacLeods were fierce, stubborn people. When the last laird died, the estate was supposedly empty, but there were rumours of a sister, a woman who had married beneath her and been struck from the family tree. She went to live in one of the remote crofts toward the northern headland. My father always dismissed it as village gossip, a way for the locals to feel the land still belonged to one of their own. N.D. What was her name? Orag, Priscilla whispered. Morag MacLeod. If she's still alive, she'd be nearly 90. But Hamish, she hasn't been seen in the village for decades. People say she's a myth, a ghost of the heather. Ha! Ish stood up, a sudden clarity sparking in his eyes. In Lochdubh, ghosts have a habit of taking on flesh and blood when their home is threatened. Julian wasn't just buying land, he was buying her history, her name, and he was going to turn it into a caricature. He was going to put neon lights on a grave. B.T. An old woman couldn't possibly overpower a man like Julian, Priscilla argued, though her voice lacked conviction. She wouldn't have to, Hamish mused, moving toward the door. Julian was a man who bowed to authority and old blood. If a MacLeod called him to the pier to discuss the future, he would have gone. He would have been flattered, and if she had something heavy, say a silver-topped walking stick, she wouldn't need much strength, just a single, well-placed moment of surprise. As he left the castle, Hamish felt the pieces of the red herring Blair was so proudly clutching begin to crumble. Blair was looking for a violent youth with a grudge. Hamish was looking for a woman with a sense of justice that predated the modern legal system. But he needed proof, and he needed to find that missing stick. E drove his battered Land Rover toward the northern headland, the road turning into little more than 2 ruts in the peat. The wind here was ferocious, whipping off the Atlantic and howling through the crags. Tucked into a fold of the hillside, almost invisible against the grey stone, was a small, ancient cottage. No smoke rose from the chimney, and the windows were as dark as sightless eyes. Uggs growled low in his throat as they approached. Hamish felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. He stepped onto the porch, the wood groaning under his weight. The door wasn't locked. It swung open with a slow, rhythmic creak that sounded like a sigh. Brah. The interior was sparse but impeccably clean. There was no television, no radio, no sign of the brr 21st century. On a small wooden table sat a teapot and a single cup. And there, resting against the hearth, was the silver-topped walking stick. It looked obscene in the humble room, its polished surface reflecting the dim light like a mocking eye. But it was what lay next to the stick that caught Hamish's breath. A pile of neon tartan, the same Lochdubh dream fabric, had been meticulously unravelled, thread by thread. The pink and lime-green fibres were heaped in the grate, ready to be burned. "It's a terrible colour, is it not, Constable?" The voice came from the shadows by the peat bed. A woman sat there, so still she might have been part of the furniture. She was wrapped in a heavy, charcoal-grey cloak, her face a map of deep lines and ancient dignity. Her eyes, however, were as sharp and blue as the loch on a summer day. "It is that, Miss MacLeod," Hamish said softly, removing his cap. "A crime against the eyes, I've always thought." "He was a small man," she said, her voice steady. "Small in soul, small in respect. He thought he could buy the wind. He thought he could buy me brr." Hamish looked at the stick, then back at the woman. He knew Blair would be here soon. The DCI was incompetent, but he was persistent, and eventually his team would trace Julian's last movements to this headland. If Hamish didn't act quickly, this old woman would spend her final days in a cold cell in Strathbane, and the village would lose the last thread of its truest history. He shouldn't To been at the pier, Hamish said, his mind whirring. It was a dangerous place for a man so careless. He fell, Morag said, her gaze never wavering. He fell into his own greed. I merely helped him find the bottom. Hamish nodded slowly. He didn't arrest her. He didn't reach for his handcuffs. Instead, he walked over to the hearth and picked up the silver-topped stick. He looked at the ornate engraving on the handle. This is a fine piece of work. It's a pity it was lost in the loch this morning. I imagine the divers will never find it in all that silt. Morag's lips thinned into what might have been a smile. The loch is very deep, Constable Macbeth. And very quiet. Aye, Hamish said, tucking the stick under his arm. Quiet is what we like in Lochdubh. He turned to leave, but paused at the door. I'll have to tell Blair something, you understand. He's already got a lad in the cells who doesn't belong there. I'll need to give him a better story than the one he's invented.
Give him the truth he deserves, Morag replied.
The truth that satisfies a man like him. Hamish stepped back out into the rain, the silver stick heavy in his hand. He had the weapon, he had the motive, and he had the killer. But as he looked back at the tiny cottage, he knew that justice in the Highlands wasn't always found in a courtroom. He had to set a trap, not for the old woman, but for the man who was currently preening himself in the village square. He had to make Blair believe he had solved the crime, while ensuring the real secret stayed buried in the heather. The drive back to Lochdubh was a slow, contemplative journey through the thickening gloom. The silver-topped walking stick lay on the passenger seat of the Land Rover, its presence a cold weight against Hamish's leg. He knew that simply handing it over to Blair would lead the DCI straight to the northern headland and Morag Macleod. Blair wouldn't see a woman defending her heritage. He would see a high-profile arrest, a chance for a promotion, and a headline that made him look like a hero. Hamish couldn't allow that, not just because of Morag, but because the village itself would never forgive the police if they dragged a 90-year-old woman through the mud for ridiculing a man who had effectively been trying to erase their identity. He reached the outskirts of the village. He saw the lights of the Lochdubh Hotel glowing warmly through the drizzle. He didn't head for the station. Instead, he pulled into the rear car park of the hotel, tucked the walking stick deep inside his oilskins, and let lugs out for a quick run. He needed a very specific kind of help, the kind that required a woman's touch and a complete lack of respect for DCI Blair's authority. He found Priscilla still at the hotel, having moved from the castle to oversee the fallout of the day's events. "You found it," she whispered, her eyes widening as Hamish subtly revealed the silver handle in the dimly lit hallway. "I found it, HBR, but—" Hamish agreed. "And I found the truth, but Blair is currently patting himself on the back for arresting Callum. If I go to him now with this, Morag Macleod's life is over. I need a way to redirect him, Priscilla. I need him to believe the killer is someone who has already left, someone he can't touch, or someone who makes him look so foolish he'll want to bury the case entirely." Priscilla looked at the stick, then at Hamish. "Elena Ponsonby. She's still in the village, Hamish. She's terrified. If Blair finds out she was at the pier, he'll pivot to her in a heartbeat. He loves a scorned woman theory almost as much as he loves a peasant revolt one. That's exactly what I'm counting on," Hamish said, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face, but not to frame her, to confuse him. "Listen, I need you to find Elena. Tell her I need her red car, just for an hour, and I need her to wait in the hotel bar with a very loud, very public glass of gin. I want everyone to see her—" "What are you going to do, Hamish?" "I'm going to use Julian's own vanity against the memory of him," Hamish replied, "and I'm going to give Blair the key to the future he's been shouting about." Hamish left Priscilla and made his way to the back of the hotel kitchen. He found a discarded roll of the neon tartan that Julian had been distributing as samples. It was garish, offensive, and perfect. He took a heavy kitchen knife and cut a long, jagged strip of the fabric. Then, moving with a surprising agility for a man of his size, he slipped out into the night. He drove to the old pier, the scene of the crime now deserted, as the Strathbane team had decamped to the local pub for their dinner. The police tape fluttered mournfully in the wind. Hamish walked to the end of the stone jetty, where the water was deep and dark. He took the silver walking stick, and with a heavy heart but a clear conscience, he tied the strip of neon tartan around the handle in an intricate, impossible-to-miss knot. Then he didn't throw it in. He wedged it firmly into a crevice in the rocks just below the waterline, where the tide would reveal it in exactly 3 hours. Next he returned to the village square. Blair was standing outside, the police station, finishing a cigarette and looking remarkably pleased with himself. Hamish approached him, his gait more shambling than usual, his eyes wide and vacant. "Ah, Macbeth," Blair sneered, blowing smoke in Hamish's direction. "Come to plead for the boy's release? Save your breath. We found a witness who saw him walking toward the pier this morning. The case is closed." "Och, is that so, sir?" Hamish said, scratching his head. "Well, that's a relief. I was worried about that red car I saw speeding away from the pier just 10 minutes ago, and the person inside. They seemed to be tossing something into the water. But if you've got your man, then I suppose it was just some tourist throwing out their rubbish." Blair froze. "A red car? What red car? A little sports thing. Very fast. I think it belongs to that London lady staying at the hotel. Miss Ponsonby, I think her name is. She looked awfully upset when I saw her earlier. Kept talking about finalizing the vision." Blair's eyes lit up with a predatory fire. "Elena Ponsonby, the ex-wife? Why wasn't I told she was in the village?" "I thought you knew, sir," Hamish said innocently. "She's been at the hotel all day. But like I said, if you've got Callum, then there's no need to worry about her, even if she was at the pier at the exact time of the murder." Blair practically threw his cigarette into the mud. "You idiot. This changes everything. A scorned wife with a financial motive? It's perfect. Why am I surrounded by morons?" He turned to Sergeant Anderson, who was standing nearby. "Anderson, get over to the hotel. I want Elena Ponsonby brought in for questioning immediately. And get a search warrant for that red car." As Blair and his team scrambled toward the hotel, Hamish stood in the rain watching them go. The trap was set. Blair would find Elena, but he would find her with a dozen witnesses who could swear she had been in the bar for the last 2 hours. He would search her car and find nothing. And just as he was reaching the height of his frustration, the tide would go out at the pier, revealing the silver-topped stick, the missing piece of the puzzle, tied with the very fabric that Blair had used to convict Callum. It would look as though the killer had tried to hide the weapon but had been clumsy. It would look as though the murder was a disorganized act of passion. Most importantly, the neon tartan tied to the stick would lead Blair in circles, suggesting a link to the textile business that didn't exist in the way he thought. By the time Blair realized the evidence didn't point to Elena or Callum, he would be so buried in contradictions and his own public mistakes that he would be desperate for any way out that didn't involve him looking like a fool. Hamish whistled for lugs and began the walk back to his cottage. He had a pot of stew on the stove that had been simmering all afternoon, and he was looking forward to a quiet evening. He had protected Morag, he had ensured Callum's eventual release, and he had made certain that Julian Ponsonby Smythe's bespoke heritage would be remembered in Lochdubh as nothing more than a bad joke found in the mud. He just had to wait for the morning, when the useless peasant would have to explain to a red-faced DCI Blair how he had managed to miss the weapon that was sitting right under their noses. The night in Lochdubh did not pass quietly for the Strathbane police, though Hamish Macbeth slept with the enviable peace of a man who had done a very tidy day's work. While Hamish dreamed of a world where salmon jumped voluntarily into his frying pan, DCI Blair was experiencing a slow-motion catastrophe. By 3 a.m, the tide had retreated from the old Macleod pier, and a constable with a powerful torch had spotted the silver glint of the walking stick wedged firmly in the rocks. It was exactly where Hamish had left it, but to the frantic eyes of the city detectives, it was a crucial discovery that immediately blew their case against young Callum Mac lean into 1,000 pieces. Hamish was awakened at dawn by the sound of a fist hammering on his cottage door. He took his time, naturally. He stoked the fire, put the kettle on, and made sure Lugs had a bowl of water before he finally unbolted the door to find a bedraggled, red-eyed, and utterly incandescent DCI Blair standing on his doorstep. The DCI's expensive shoes were ruined, caked in salt and silt, and his face was no longer the colour of tinned ham. It had reached a shade of dark plum that suggested an impending medical event. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, pushing past him into the kitchen. "You're a curse. This whole village is a curse. We found the weapon, tied with that neon rag, and we found your red car woman at the hotel, only to have 20 locals swear she was drinking gin under their noses the whole night. Even the minister's wife says she saw her there. Are you telling me I've got a killer who can be in 2 places at once?" Hamish blinked, looking remarkably slow and confused. "Oh, that is a puzzle, sir. But then, the Highland mist can play tricks on a man's eyes. Maybe it wasn't a car I saw, but A shadow, and the stick, you say, at the pier? Well, I suppose that means Callum couldn't have done it, seeing as he was in your cells when the tide went out and revealed it. Blair slumped into a chair, his head in his hands. I've had to release the boy. His uncle, that savage Weaver, is threatening to sue the department. And the press is asking why we focused on a local youth when the victim's own ex-wife was in town with a motive the size of Ben Nevis. But I can't arrest her because she has an ironclad alibi. Someone is lying, Macbeth. Everyone in this miserable glen is lying. It's a complicated place, Lochdubh, Hamish said mildly, handing Blair a mug of tea. People here don't like to be told what to do, or what to wear, or what to think. Mr. Ponsonby Smythe was a man who did all three. Blair looked up, his eyes narrowing. What are you getting at? You think one of these peasants did it and the rest are covering for them? Is that it? A conspiracy of silence? I think, Hamish said, choosing his words with the care of a man walking on thin ice, that if you want to catch the killer, you have to stop looking for someone who hates progress and start looking for someone who loves the past. Julian wasn't just building a retreat, he was erasing a name, and names are the only thing some people have left. Blair snorted, splashing tea onto his shirt. Philosophy? I don't need philosophy, I need a collar. If it's not the boy and it's not the wife, then who? Give me a name, Macbeth, or so help me. I'll have you directing traffic in Strathbane for the rest of your miserable career. I might have an idea, sir, Hamish said, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper, but it requires a bit of a theatre. You see, the person who did this is proud. They think they've won. They think they've saved the village. If we were to announce that the Macleod estate sale was going through anyway, that a new, even more aggressive developer from London was coming in to finish what Julian started, the killer might just show their hand again, especially if we mention that the new developer is planning to bulldoze the northern headland to make way for a golf course. Blair stared at him, a slow, cunning light dawning in his eyes. He didn't care about the ethics of the trap, he only cared about the result. A golf course on the headland? That'll get them riled up. Right, we'll leak it to the postmistress. By noon the whole village will know. And then, Hamish added, we wait at the pier, tonight, at the same time Julian died. I've a feeling the killer won't be able to resist one last clean-up of the new threat. S. Blair hurried out to coordinate his brilliant new strategy. Hamish watched him go with a heavy heart. He had set the trap, but it wasn't for Morag Macleod. He knew the old woman wouldn't leave her cottage. She had done what she felt was necessary, and she was prepared to wait for the end. No, the person he was targeting was someone far more dangerous, someone who had used the old woman's legend as a shield, someone who knew exactly where the silver stick had been hidden and had moved it to the cottage to ensure that if the police ever did search the headland, they would find a convenient, ancient scapegoat. Mish knew that Morag hadn't moved the stick. She was too old, too frail to be wandering back and forth from the pier to her cottage in the middle of a storm. Someone else had killed Julian, perhaps at Morag's request, or perhaps to protect her, and then they had attempted to frame the very person they claimed to be saving. He finished his tea and began to prepare. He didn't take his handcuffs. He took a long, sturdy length of rope and a heavy torch. He knew that tonight would not be about fingerprints or DNA. It would be about the darkness of the human heart, and a grudge that had festered in the Highland rain for far too long. He looked at Luggs, who was watching him with intelligent, soulful eyes. "It's a dirty business, lad," Hamish murmured, "but somebody has to keep the peace, even if the peace is built on a lie." The afternoon passed in a blur of whispers. Mrs. Kennedy was indeed the perfect conduit. By 3 o'clock, the entire village was in an uproar about the fictional golf course. Hamish stayed out of sight, mooching a bit of lunch at the hotel but avoiding the bar where Elena Ponsonby was packing her bags, eager to leave the village that had treated her like a murderess. He saw Priscilla briefly, and the look they exchanged was one of grim understanding. The stage was set, the mist was rolling in again, thicker and colder than before, and as the light began to fail, Hamish Macbeth headed toward the pier, not as a hunter, but as a man waiting for the shadows to reveal their true shape. The final confrontation was coming, and for once, Hamish wasn't sure if he wanted to win. The mist on the loch was no longer a mere atmospheric detail. It had become a thick, suffocating shroud that dampened sound and distorted distance. Hamish crouched low behind a pile of lobster creels near the base of the pier, his oilskins slick with the salt spray. He had sent Blair and his men to the opposite side of the bay, telling them the killer would likely approach by boat to avoid the police cordon. It was a lie, of course. Blair was currently shivering in a damp thicket 2 miles away, clutching a pair of night vision goggles that were likely fogging up in the highland humidity. Hamish wanted the silence. He needed the killer to feel entirely alone. Lugg sat perfectly still beside him, his ears pricked, his nose twitching at the scent of old fish and something sharper, the metallic tang of the coming tide. The village was a distant cluster of amber lights, appearing far away and unreachable. Hamish checked his watch. It was nearly the hour. The rumour of the golf course and the new aggressive developer had worked better than he'd hoped. It wasn't just about the land, it was about the desecration of a sanctuary. A soft, rhythmic sound reached his ears. It wasn't the engine of a car or the splash of an oar, it was the steady, heavy thud of a boot on stone. Someone was walking onto the pier with the confidence of a person who owned the very air they breathed. Hamish didn't move. He watched as a figure emerged from fog, silhouetted against the pale grey of the water. They were tall, broader than Morag MacLeod, and they were carrying something long and thin, a heavy iron pry-bar from the hardware shop. His figure reached the end of the pier and stood exactly where Julian Ponsonby Smythe had breathed his last. They looked out over the water, their posture radiating a cold, focused fury. Then they began to strike the stone bollard, the iron bar clanging against the rock with a desperate, ringing violence as if they were trying to shatter the very foundation of the pier itself. "It's a lot of work for a Tuesday night, Porrick," Hamish said, stepping out from the shadows. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it carried through the mist like a gunshot. His figure spun around, the pry-bar raised. The light from Hamish's torch caught the man's face. It was Porrick, the hardware shop owner, the man who had stood on this very pier the morning before, shaking his head in feigned tragedy. But the mild-mannered shopkeeper was gone. In his place was a man whose eyes were bright with a manic ancestral fire. "You should have stayed in your kitchen, Macbeth," Porrick spat, his breath hitching. "You and your coffee and your laziness. You don't understand. You're not from the old blood. You're just a servant of the state." "I understand more than you think, Porrick," Hamish said, keeping his torch steady. "I understand that Morag MacLeod is your aunt. I understand that when Julian Ponsonby Smythe told her he was going to turn her family's history into a theme park, she didn't just sit and weep. She called her nephew, the man who had the keys to every shed in this village, the man who could move through the shadows without anyone noticing." Porrick lowered the bar slightly, but his grip remained white-knuckled. "He was going to destroy it, Hamish. He was going to put a gift shop on the site of the old croft. He laughed at her. He told her she was a squatter on her own ancestral soil. I didn't mean to kill him at first. I just wanted to frighten him. I brought him here to show him the water, to tell him how many men the MacLeods had lost to that loch." "But he didn't frighten easy, did he?" Hamish prompted softly. "He was too arrogant for fear, bruh. He mocked me. He waved that silver stick in my face and told me he'd have the police clear Morag out by the weekend. So I took the stick from him. It was easy. He was soft. And then I saw that neon filth in his pocket, those samples he was so proud of. It felt right to let him choke on his own progress, but Hamish nodded. "And then you panicked. You knew Morag was the only one with a real motive, so you tried to protect her by framing her, just enough to confuse the trail. You took the stick to her cottage, knowing if Blair found it there, he'd never believe an old woman did the deed alone, or he'd be so tied up in legal knots he'd lose the scent. But then you saw the chance to frame the boy, and then the wife. You've been busy, Porrick." "I did it for the land," Porrick shouted, the sound echoing off the hills. "And now you say there's another one. Another Londoner coming for the headland. A golf course. I won't let it happen, Macbeth. I'll break every stone of this pier before I let them land another boat here." "There is no other developer, Porrick," Hamish said, stepping closer, his hand moving toward the length of rope at his belt. "It was just a story, a way to bring you out. The village is safe, but you aren't." Porrick let out a low, guttural cry and lunged. For all his apparent laziness, Hamish Macbeth was a man of the hills, his muscles hardened by miles of walking and the sheer physical demand of Highland life. He dodged the swing of the iron bar with a grace that would have stunned DCI Blair. As Porrick overbalanced, Hamish didn't strike him. He used the man's own momentum, catching his arm and spinning him toward the ground. Lugs barked, a sharp, authoritative sound that seemed to signal the end of the struggle. Hamish was on Porrick in an instant, pinning his arms with a strength that was sudden and absolute. There was no high-tech struggle, no cinematic gunplay. It was a messy, desperate scuffle in the mud and the mist, the two men breathing hard as the reality of the situation settled over them. "It's over, Porrick," Hamish whispered, his voice tinged with a genuine sadness. "The MacLeods deserve better than a murder to their name. Brr." Porrick went limp, the fight draining out of him as Coolburper. Ickly as it had arrived, he began to sob, a dry, racking sound that was lost to the wind. Hamish stood up, pulling the shopkeeper to his feet. He didn't use the handcuffs, he simply kept a firm grip on the man's elbow, guiding him back toward the village. As they walked, the blue lights of Blair's returning patrol cars began to flicker in the distance. Hamish knew what was coming. Blair would be furious at being misled, then triumphant when he realized the killer was in custody. He would take the credit, he would write the reports, and he would likely get the promotion he so desperately craved. Hamish looked at the shivering man beside him, and then out at the dark, silent loch. He had a choice to make. He could be the hero, or he could be the man who stayed in Lochdubh. The decision, as always, was easy. He just had to make sure Blair felt like the smartest man in the room one last time. The blue lights of the police convoy finally arrived, piercing the thick Highland mist with an artificial, stuttering glare. DCI Blair was the first out of the car, his face a mask of cold fury. He had spent the last 3 hours shivering in a bog, convinced that a fleet of London developers was about to make an amphibious landing. When he saw Hamish standing at the edge of the road, calmly holding a weeping muddy Porrick by the arm, his jaw dropped so far it was a wonder it didn't hit his chest. "Macbeth!" Blair screamed, his voice cracking with the strain of his ordeal. "What is the meaning of this? Why aren't you at your post? And why are you molesting the local tradesman?" Hamish adopted his most vacant, simple-minded expression, blinking slowly against the strobe of the police lights. He nudged the iron pry bar toward Blair with the toe of his boot. "Oh, I'm terribly sorry, sir. I think I've made a bit of a mess of your brilliant plan. You see, while you were out there strategically guarding the northern flank, I happened to run into poor Porrick here. He was sleepwalking, I think. Overcome with the stress of your investigation, no doubt." Porrick looked up, his eyes glazed, but Hamish's grip on his arm tightened, a silent command to stay quiet. "Sleepwalking?" Blair spat, stepping closer. "With a crowbar?" "Aye," Hamish said, leaning in as if sharing a profound secret. "He was so distraught by the brilliance of your theory about the ex-wife, the way you cornered her at the hotel, that he felt he had to come down here to tidy up the evidence for you. He found the weapon you were looking for, sir, the real one. He was just about to bring it to you when I stumbled over him. I dare say if you hadn't put the fear of God into the village with your clever golf course rumour, he never would have cracked and shown us where the motive lay." Blair paused. The gears of his ambition were turning visibly behind his bulging eyes. He looked at the shattered Porrick, then at the iron bar, and finally at the cowering villagers who had begun to gather at the edge of the square. If he admitted Hamish had caught the man, it was just another local arrest. But if he framed it as the culmination of his own psychological warfare, the golf course gambit, he was a tactical genius. "I see," Blair said, his voice suddenly dropping into a deep, authoritative register for the benefit of the nearby sergeant's notebook. "So my pressure worked. I knew the aggressive developer angle would flush out the sentimentalists. Porrick, you are under arrest for the murder of Julian Ponsonby Smeeth. Take him away, Anderson." As the police bundled the broken hardware shop owner into the back of a van, Blair turned to Hamish, a look of immense condescension on his face. "You got lucky, Macbeth. You happened to be standing in the right place while I was doing the heavy lifting. I'll be sure to mention in my report that you provided clerical assistance. Don't expect a commendation. In fact, expect a reprimand for leaving your post." "I wouldn't dream of it, sir," Hamish said, touching his cap. "I'm just glad the case is solved. It would have been a tragedy if a man of your stature had been forced to stay in Lochdubh any longer. The city needs you, sir." Blair preened, adjusting his tie. "Yes, well, duty calls. We'll be out of your hair by morning. Try not to let any more Londoners get murdered while I'm gone." The convoy roared out of Lochdubh an hour later, a symphony of sirens and self-importance fading into the distance. The village returned to its natural heavy silence. The bespoke heritage samples were hauled away as evidence, and the red sports car of Elena Ponsonby had already crossed the border. Its driver vowed never to look at a piece of tartan again. The next morning the sun made a rare, timid appearance, casting a golden light over the peaks of the mountains. Hamish sat at his kitchen table, the familiar smell of wood smoke and frying bacon filling the small room. Luggs was gnawing on a particularly large bone, a gift from the hotel kitchen, and a fresh pot of coffee sat on the stove. There was a soft knock at the door. It was Priscilla. She looked tired, but there was a faint, knowing smile on her lips. "He's gone, then?" she asked, taking the cup of coffee Hamish offered. "Aye. Blair's halfway to Strathbane, dreaming of his superintendent's stripes," Hamish replied. "And Porrick? Well, Porrick will have a long time to think about the land, but he won't be lonely. Morag MacLeod sent word that she'll be paying for his defence." "Bah!" Priscilla looked at him over the rim of her mug. "You didn't tell Blair about her, did you? About the cottage or the cloak?" Hamish looked out the window at the northern headland, where the mist was finally lifting. "I told him everything he needed to know to be happy, Priscilla. And in Lochdubh, happiness is a very fragile thing. It's better to let the old ghosts sleep. And what about you, Hamish? You solved a high-profile murder and gave away all the credit. Again. You'll be a constable until you're 80. Hamish leaned back, listening to the gentle lap of the waves against the shore and the distant cry of a golden eagle. The peace of the Highlands settled over him like a warm blanket. He was poor, he was lonely, and his boss thought he was an idiot. He couldn't have been more content. "Aye," Hamish said, a twinkle of dry Highland humour in his blue eyes. "It's a terrible fate, is it not? Having to stay in a place like this with nothing to do but fish for my dinner and avoid the work." He reached for a piece of toast, the butter melting into the golden crust. The mystery of Julian Ponsonby Smythe was over, buried under layers of official paperwork and village secrets. Lochdubh had been saved from progress, at least for another season. Hamish took a long, satisfying sip of his coffee and closed his eyes. The world was quiet once more, and for a man like Hamish Macbeth, that was the greatest reward of all.